Hi, Martha. So wonderful to see you.
Hi,
Um,
Sheridan.
and hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Martha's first event, which is really exciting, and we're thrilled that the Center for Fiction is hosting her first event. And I have some questions about the novel "Buy Me Love." It's just a wonderful read. But what I thought I would do first is ask Martha just to read a little tiny section of it to sort of give you a sense both of the voice in which it's written, and it also sets up the premise, or partly the premise. So Martha, if you would go ahead.
I am happy to do that, but before I do that, I want to thank Melanie and the Center for Fiction. I want to thank my dear friend Sheridan Hay, and I want to thank all of you out there, whether it's 1 o'clock or whatever time it may be, for taking this hour to be with me and to celebrate this. This means a huge amount to me, so I'm just delighted to be here. Thanks greatly to everyone. So, okay, so that little section that Sheridan has asked me to read. On the sidewalk, she took his elbow. Listen to me, Win. We're just going to get the newspaper and check the numbers. We can't let anyone around us know what's going on. Total silence, all right? In the morning light, his face looked sallow, the shadows under his eyes more pronounced than usual. All right, he replied. But if you've won a couple $100,000, you'll at least take me out to breakfast? The jackpot's a whole lot bigger than a few $100,000. And if I've won, I'm going to get right back on the subway and go home. To do what? Consult with your cats, see if they approve? I'm serious, Win. I'll need time. He clucked his tongue. Like, till tomorrow? Listen to me. If I've won, I'll need to figure out what to do, how to, to live with it. I mean, it'll be the end of everything, of my life as it is. They walked a few paces in silence. Win said quietly, I'm sure you haven't won, but you do realize you're making it sound like you've received a death warrant? His smile was tight. He was angry. I don't mean it that way, she said. It's just such a shock, so absurd. It wouldn't be the end of your life. Why make it sound that way? Look, I know I'm just in a total tizzy. You sure are. The newspaper kiosk is over there. Let's go check the numbers.
Let's check the numbers. So you get a sense, just even in that little short bit, that is Ellen, the protagonist, who's 52-year-old poet, a poet who's not writing poetry, who's stuck essentially, and her grief-stricken brother, who's rapidly becoming an alcoholic, who she needs to support. But what that little section sets up is this almost preposterous notion, certainly preposterous to Ellen, the protagonist, that this random act of purchasing a lottery ticket may well change everything. And the novel is a whole sort of chamber of resonances about luck and chance and change and really how to live. So I guess my first question really is, Martha, what drew you to this sort of question, a way to examine kind of the arbitrary nature of the world? I guess that's how I would ask you. It's because it's marvelous and outlandish at the same time, so it's a real challenge to enter into something so almost magical.
Well, it's a great question. And I mean, your adjectives are great too, marvelous and outlandish, which frankly is our experience in the world a lot of the time, isn't it? So, I mean, I didn't set out to write about marvelous and outlandish experience or about arbitrariness. I mean, I think if I recall correctly, and who knows, memory is capricious in these things, but I think that the germ of it came actually from the opening moment in the novel where the protagonist sees this piece of paper with these numbers on it. And I did, in fact, see a piece of paper wafting up, brought up by air, a sort of a whoosh of air, and pressed against the underside of a grate on a New York City sidewalk. Now, this kind of thing happens, all the time. It happened to me, and I remember seeing stuff scrawled on the paper. And what happened in that moment was my thinking, what are those numbers and what might those numbers mean to someone? I wasn't thinking about lottery tickets or buying a ticket. But for some reason, right in that moment, what flashed in my head was a number I hadn't thought of for decades, which was my childhood phone number. I don't know how many of you out there can recall the phone number in the place where you grew up. I happened to be in one house till I was about 12. And so it had a phone number and I memorized it as a kid. And that number came into my head and I hadn't thought of it in years. And it was almost as if it were just this premonitory thing, like, oh, why that number now? And that one thing then led to another, as things do when you're thinking of writing something. And I thought, well, what might one do with those numbers? And then I realized too that for some time I had been thinking about money as the subject of fiction. When is it the subject of fiction? In what ways do novels in particular contend with it? And I thought, well, gee, I think about it and worry about it. Why not write about it? And somehow those two things sort of came together in this question of what happens if someone bet on those numbers? And then it was like, well, lottery. And of course, that took me to, I don't really want to write about someone wins the lottery and how do they spend the money. That's not interesting. That's not, there's nothing really curious about that. It struck me that what was interesting was the period of time between the purchase of a ticket, the revelation that there had been this win, and the time in which the ticket would have to be redeemed, which puts under pressure the arbitrariness. It puts under pressure the fact that this outrageous, preposterous thing has just happened, but you have to respond by a date certain. It's not, you're not in that space of craziness forever. Something will then give, something will then change.
What you do, but consequently, you do a really brilliant thing in the novel that ends up being both, that serves both the narrative and the structure of the novel, is that you set a clock ticking, right? But there's, as I said, this sort of this chamber of resonances. One of the resonances through, and one of the thematic elements then becomes this question of time, and how does one use one's time, and what and how does time use an individual as well, and I wonder if you can talk about that sort of, because the other really brilliant thing that it struck me was that time becomes a currency in the same way as you're writing about money. So you have two currencies, all of a sudden. One is one determined by the clock, and the other is equally abstract, actually, which is that money is this sort of abstract concept. And your protagonist, Ellen, never really spends any time, contemplating how she's going to, what necessarily the purchases, that she has no interest really in that. What she really has interest in is in her stuckedness, how she's going to change. And she thinks, she thinks at one point when it came to money, nobody was ever talking about the same thing. So it's this idea that there's this sort of all of this delusion around money, because there's no register that balances it. And equally, the way people are either using or wasting their time as this clock is ticking through the novel, the month that Ellen has to redeem the ticket, is the theater in which, which holds all the action. So that seems to me to have been a brilliant stroke to have arrived at. Because so if you could just really talk about the, ideas, her brother says no, a brother who suffered a traumatic loss of a partner says nobody's got plenty of time. And, we move through the novel with this sense of, will Ellen get to a notion of how time has served her,
Yeah, absolutely. When her brother is terrifically impatient with her because, as you just said, of the trauma of losing his partner in a terrorist event. And so he sort of represents the extreme of, this is just nuts, just go turn in the ticket. What on earth could you possibly be waiting for? There's a child in the book, for whom time is as money is, not a fun thing to think about. It's not interesting. Ennio doesn't care. Time doesn't operate for him. It doesn't operate for any child in the same way as it does for an adult. Children don't experience urgencies in the way, temporal urgencies in the way that adults do. So Ennio's sort of another extreme of the one who really could care less, who doesn't look at watches or clocks or calendars. And then in between, we have, Ellen's initial sense of, I'll just take the time because I have it. But then she's tugged on both by the relationship that begins to develop with Roy and a question of how long can I go on with a sort of charade? What do I do with the people around me who don't know that this has happened to me? And how will this sort of rearrange the furniture, if you will, of my relationships with them? What will it do to upend the kinds of trusts that I feel I have with friends, with a potential new romance, with a child? The currencies of time and money also for her get all kind of wound up in currencies of emotional currency of candor versus concealment or silence, versus speech. And there's so much uncertainty in her that for quite a while, the stuckness gets really activated even more. She's really having trouble breaking out of it, even though she realizes something's got to give. This can't go on forever. There's also, of course, the other character in the book, Blair, the other protagonist whose story threads through hers. And Blair too is under pressure, financial pressure, and therefore time pressure. So I realized as I began to write the novel that I needed some other countervailing force, someone with a very different agenda and very different notions of what intimacy might mean or would never mean, could not mean. So I wanted Blair to sort of be a counterpoint always to Ellen, because Blair's actually pretty active, whereas Ellen is kind of passive for a fair bit of the book in a certain sense.
Yes, well, that's always the challenge when you've created a character who is essentially stuck, whether it's emotionally or otherwise, and the process of the narrative is a working through of that stuckness. And you're right that Blair is very active. Maybe you could describe her. They're both artists, although, as you say, Blair is actively an artist, creating something transient in her concept of art, which again is a sort of a resonance of time, right? That it's fleeting, and she does it in public spaces. Well, I'll let you describe it, but my question really about Blair, which maybe you could weave in also too, is as a counterpoint, and these two plots running parallel until a certain point when they overlap. This is a character of deep disturbance, and so she has latched onto Camus as a sort of a figure of wisdom, a sort of a a presiding sage, which is wonderful for the narrative because you have, then you weave in different sort of notions of art, always go too far, for example, because that's the only way you'll find the truth. She remembers Camus, reading of Camus, but of course, she's a character who's disturbed. So it puts another sort of slant on, on her capacity to even to even interpret this wisdom, so to speak, or this sort of philosophical position that she's thinks she's embracing. So if you could talk about Blair a little bit, that would be really interesting to me.
Well, thinks she's embracing is absolutely it, Sheridan, because, I first of all, I am not a Camus scholar, and in no way, did I want my book to somehow seem to be representing Camus as Camus might be said to be in his own writings. We have a young, disturbed artist, woman, for whom gender itself is quite complex, and she is kind of a magpie picking at Camus, just cherry picking things and kind of using them to reinforce some of her own instincts and intuitions in her life. She comes from an incredibly troubled family. In some ways, my novel, I should mention, has these sort of two brother-sister combinations. You've got Ellen and her brother Wynne, the alcoholic who has lost his partner in this bombing in Madrid in 2000, or a couple of years before the action in 2005. And then you've got Blair and her brother who's gone missing, and with whom she was early entangled. And I don't really want to talk too much about that, but her entanglement with him and the fact that he is gone and that she can't account for where he is or why he is no longer in her life has really done a number on her. She's been very, very damaged by what happened and what is still happening in terms of her first family. And so, she needs Camus, and she needs her sense of street art that she does as ephemera, and as something that necessarily must come and go. She needs all that for her own emotional purposes to kind of shore up her own ruins, if you will. And she's therefore very differently positioned toward the making of art than Ellen, who had this chapbook come out 15 years earlier. After that point, published just a poem here or there in lit mags, and basically wasn't and hasn't been able to get any traction on her career as a poet, or her work as a poet, and has been sort of cobbling together a freelance existence all along. Both these characters need money. They're both living kind of marginalized lives financially. Neither of them can count on a steady stream of money. One becomes very active in the art anyway. The other is unable to claim that. So one has this sense of urgency, and the other has somehow managed to get to age 52 without feeling it so strongly. Indeed, sort of, trying always to almost return to a more childlike state where you don't have to think about it. But then circumstances, i.e., being in possession of $100 million lottery ticket, a winning ticket, circumstances force all this to a head. And I knew that I wanted some character also in the art realm, as is Wynne, because Wynne's a composer.
Actually, I was going to get to that.
Well, we can take him up in a minute, but you have these three characters in three different art realms: visual art, music, and writing, poetry in particular, who are really, have a really different orientation toward the making of their work, toward why it matters, toward what they expect from it. And I wanted that. I thought that the novel couldn't really succeed with just one person in that realm. There had to be I had to sort of stake out a couple of different possibilities, and then have this child too, who is sort of naturally, in his curiosity and his sort of own improvisational sense, he's a natural he's sort of the prototype of any artist, you know, that
Mhm.
openness and
Mhm.
that,
Receptivity.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In the ways that the other three adult artists are. I mean, their receptivity is one of the things that they're struggling with, in the sense that their damage has blocked them.
Yeah.
But you reminded me of something too when you mentioned that Wynne is a artist and a composer, and one of the real gifts of the novel is the way that music goes um, through the narrative, and even in, you know, in almost punning ways, which are very charming. Before we move away from Blair, one of the first ways in which we're introduced to her is that she's painting money on the sidewalk. And it's $100 bill, but that it starts being referred to as a C note, which is also seems musical to me. And so there, you know, there are sort of wonderful things like that. And then, of course, Wynne as a composer um, just talks, when he's younger, talks about that composing music is playing with time, which of course is what, you know, thematically is what's happening all the way through the novel, that this clock is ticking, and you know, and the tension is how will the time be played out, you know,
Yeah.
how will the life within a fixed period of time alter and change under this circumstance. So, you know, change and chance are also elements that go all the way through, and the epigraph is so perfect for the novel. The epigraph is from a poem called Discovery by Anne Pearson Weiss. This is the epigraph. It's the surprise of change that makes good fortune and bad luck feel the same. Good fortune and bad luck feel the same. And that seems so. There's an exchange later on in the very touching and very, I mean, the romance in the novel is so lightly done and very beautiful. But at one point in Ellen, now protagonist, and her romantic interest, she's sort of starting to feel out what, you know, so she to feel what his response may well be. And she asks him, if you won a lot of money, you know, what would you change? And he says, change? She says, in your life. You know, he says, my guess is you'd be in no position to change much of anything. And she says, why not? Because that kind of money would change you. So, but what's fascinating in the narrative is that we're seeing her change already without any money having arrived necessarily, you know. So this arbitrary act has happened, and you know, and you could say that it set things into motion, but there's a question all the way through the novel is, well, you know, what's really changing her is love. Is even that possibility. So I wonder if you could just really talk about that you know, the relationship between chance and the possibility of change, and how that how you conceived of that in relation to you know, we've already talked about money and time in relation to, you know, how you came to come to conceive the narrative.
Well, it's a great question. And, you know, it's a question that had me all kind of balled up for years, really. This book took a long time to write. If there are writers out there who are taking a long time to write a book, don't worry. I got like 15 years to show you here between.
It'll all come together in the end.
And, you know, I was doing all kinds of strange things in my mind around this story, thinking, well, you know, maybe she just, you know, maybe she'll just throw the ticket out at the end, or, you know, I was like trying to figure out how do I wind this down if I don't want to get to a, you know, showing what she does with the money. what are my options? And it became increasingly clear. You're so correct about these two currencies of time and money. And the more she bumped into the question of spending or of feeling spent, of feeling tired, of all the sort of metaphorical dimensions of spending and getting and spending and all of that, the more she realized that what the real paucity in her life had nothing to do with money, but this sort of fear of certain kinds of new connections. And, she had what she calls her nearest and dearest, a handful of close friends, of whom this guy, Dale, her oldest, is the one who kind of understands her best and can periodically toss out the right question or the right comment to help her put things in focus. But those characters don't appear often in the book, and that was really to highlight the isolation into which she has really fallen when the reader encounters her. And so this ticket and the pressures it brings to her arrive at a moment that really is sort of make it or break it for her. And I think for her, the fact that Roy has a kid attached and that kid attached, which I won't get into now because I don't really want to spoil it, but yeah, but that the fact of Ennio is sort of the extra spin, if you will, the elevation, the ratcheting up of the pressure, and also the opening up of an opportunity or of a chance, and
the way a child pushes through into intimacy.
Yeah, and
literally and figuratively, actually.
Yes, and the way that the child's questions and comments just tossed off, without any sense of what am I saying, what might this mean. There's a kind of liberatory quality to his way of being in the world that I think was the answer I was looking for. And I didn't initially plan to have a child in the book. I mean, I thought of it as these are adult questions, and what's that Fran Lebowitz line, like, why have children? You can't borrow money from them, So I thought, initially, well, children, there's no place for a child in a story about money, but it turned out there was.
Yeah. And it also gives you this sort of wonderful, it also makes her deferral, Ellen's postponement or paralysis, or however, it's not really a paralysis, because all of a sudden her life is changing, not because of this abstract fact of a lottery ticket. Her life is changing. So there's this wonderful irony that the deferral, that life is happening in the deferral. So you think that this is a postponement, but actually it's not.
It's actually a heightening. I mean, that was the technical challenge, to not make a stuck book about stuckness.
It's just
to find a way to keep propulsion, forward motion going. And that meant having things around her be happening. And one of those things, for instance, is Wynn's dead lover's sister comes back. This is a very sibling-ish book.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Because the sibling comes back to the United States from Spain, and where the lover was killed. And so that adds also, it's that sort of triangulation that sometimes fiction needs, bring a third party into a couple of any kind and bring in the unexpected demands that third party poses, and new things get set into play, and new opportunities for tension, for surprise. And once I got her back in the mix, things heated up also with Wynn, the brother. He became a more active player. Initially, he was just sort of a passive drunk kind of.
He's a tremendously sympathetic figure also, I think, but I also think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's a composer, and the sound of music going through the whole book, not just connected to him, but I mean, from the title to even to talk about a C note or money as a note. there's just these wonderful sort of parallels that and musicality that it hadn't really, and even in the way in which Ellen remembered her childhood phone number was a trio and a quartet, because her father was a singer.
Yeah.
Won't go into that whole backstory, but as a consequence, there is music all of the way through the novel, and composition. And so you're implicit is this kind of parallels between composing a narrative and composing a score. And Wynne sort of seems to be going off on a very abstract deep end, where he's not doing notations anymore in the way of writing music, but he's drawing music, which seems so interesting to me and links him back then to this other storyline of the artist. But Ellen says, at one point, so let's get this straight. Seeing's a kind of hearing, and hearing's a way of seeing. Composition is recomposition with the listener, the viewer that is, not the composer carrying the ball over the finish line. Welcome to Wynne's world. But when I read that, I thought composition is recomposition with the listener, not the composer carrying the ball. And I thought, well, are you talking about writing also too? That, is composition in terms of narrative recomposition, and that it's the reader who, carries it forward.
Absolutely. I think, that connection has to be there and has to be implicit in this story. And, for Wynne too, the fact that he has tinnitus, and that therefore, the way sound operates for him has changed, and he's had to adapt. And also that the role that trauma played in his wife caused him to adapt, I think, is also just a subtle, additional pressure on her, on Ellen, his sister, to think through, well, how and when can I adapt? What's going to be required here? What will I have to, let go of? Yes, part of it. Be willing to gain, and just give way to, just not impede anymore. So all of that worked together for me over time to help me understand the Wynne Ellen relationship as pretty central to the story, even if Wynne isn't in it all the time or all that often.
Yes, and she learns something from him. Deeply before the end. But it reminds me that, that when you're talking about it having taken so long, that, it's kind of ironically funny that a book that is actually that I experience as being very elaborately plotted is essentially about chance and the arbitrary nature of the workings of the world, because there's nothing arbitrary in structuring an elaborate plot, especially one that almost has a mathematical symmetry required for the double plot to cross at a particular point. So for the writers out there, I wonder if you could really sort of, talk about that, and if that at what point that struck you, that here you are talking about, randomness and arbitrariness and chance, and you're having to make it more like a notation, like a musical score.
Yeah, I mean,
every note needed to correspond with another note.
It did, and that was the hardest and the most interesting and challenging work of the book. And it took time for me to even dial into focus that would be required in the way that it was. I mean, I'm not someone who plots in advance. I'm not a mystery writer. I don't have that. So I just had to fumble my way through and just feel my way through what was making sense emotionally, what was making sense in terms of the construct I'd created, where a ticket is acquired on a date certain and it has to be redeemed on a date certain. So things did have to transpire within that period of time. I knew I wanted the countervailing force of Blair, and I knew that I wanted some kind of an intersection, and I knew that it would be likely to happen near, if not at the very end. So pressures had to accumulate, conflicts had to be set into play and start, reaching their crescendos prior to whatever intersection might happen between the two characters. Beyond that, I have to say, it was just such a trial and error thing, just sort of listening for beats. It did feel very musical to me in that sense, just listening for beats. Is it a beat too many or too few? Looking for where tension sagged. It can't be at a fever pitch, that doesn't work either. So
which is one of the reasons why the gradual emotional opening and the encounter, the romantic encounter, then starts to, then the sort of warmth comes through,
right,
the whole narrative.
And the reader had to start feeling, this is real, this could happen, this is real, without it being schmaltzy, but that it could actually happen. And the question of coincidences, I mean, at one point, Bruno, the partner of Ellen and Wynn's father, says coincidences are like salt sprinkled on our lives. And I really believe that. I mean, people say, oh, too many coincidences in fiction, that's, that strains credulity. And to which I say, it all depends on how they're presented. It all depends on how they operate, because what are our lives if not ridiculous numbers of coincidences? I mean, just crazy stuff all the time.
Exactly.
So we understand that, and yet we balk if we see it in fiction if it isn't handled correctly. So for me, it was just, saying, where am I bumping up against? Okay, this is a pile-on. Versus where do I need that? Geez, you're kidding. Wow. Well, gosh, gee, look at that. That spawns this, which spawns that. So that it could be a credible sort of,
Yes. I mean, I think it's one of the real accomplishments of the novel is its credibility. Right, because if you think that it's going to be a novel about about a chance encounter with good fortune, and it actually the good fortune has no relationship to the initial sort of setup. It's about something different. I don't want to forget to also mention that the novel is a complete love letter to Brooklyn. and here we are, the Center for Fiction in Brooklyn, and you've left Brooklyn, so I don't know if that sort of felt elegiac to you in that way, but these characters travel by subway, as you can tell by the cover of the novel. Subways and moving about Brooklyn it's tremendously vivid. And
I had so much fun doing it. I mean, I love Brooklyn. I'm actually here in Forest Hills, Queens, which I've also grown fond of, especially in this year of lockdown. Forest Park, New Yorkers, check out Forest Park. Just as good as Prospect Park, maybe better. But I really love Brooklyn and love my 20 years there. And so it was a pleasure to, kind of map where my people would be and figure out how they'd get to one another by train. There are ways in which the train stuff is linked also to trauma. And I knew that pretty early on about Wynn and then about Ennio, the boy. So that was really fun to do.
Birds blow through, which is lovely. Roy starts to his name of affectionate nickname for Ellen is Dove. So and then there's another whole resonance with that too. So it's one gets to the end of the novel kind of astonished at all these linkages, that they're not, it's not that you strike them hard, it's just that that they're all interwoven. And it seems to me that the real lesson of taking a long time with a novel is taking the time to see how those things start to suggest one thing suggests another, you know, how the chance encounter changes everything, how, you know, what's the cost of staying in place suggests, you know, ideas about money and debt, and time, and how long one has, and the relationship between that and art and music and poetry. It becomes tremendously richly interwoven, and I think that has to take time. No.
Well, it's very gratifying. Thank you, Sheridan, for saying that. I mean, I wanted a kind of intricacy, but not that would feel gamey or tricksy for its own sake. You know, that's tedious. I knew it had to arise organically, the kind of intricacy that is our experience, you know, the interweavings that we all know and live with every day, the subtle points of echo and connection that are lighting up or sounding off all the time for us, visually, orally, you know. And I knew that would take time to do. I've been writing essays too, in a form where I'm trying to sort of make pinging noises between elements. So I think the nonfiction work helped me in some ways with the fiction, and vice versa. But it's
actually the chapter heads all the way through the novel feel very essayistic in that sense as well too, because it gives you a sort of just a little ping to
a kind of mini focus that is also kind of a caprice, you know. And isn't that also what happens? And think about, you know, the opening of like Mrs. Dalloway, or you know, or Ulysses, for God's sake, you know, just this sense of ping ping ping, and the reader's already in, like, I heard that. Or David Markson's work, another example of where you see that kind of thing going on. You see it, you feel it, but you might not be conscious of it all the way through. And I think that gives readerly pleasure. When the reader's like, oh, saw the other penny drop there and the shoe fall there, it's boring. It has to all happen with a lighter touch. And I guess that, well, if it took time, okay.
Well, so it's the rewards of time. I should get to the some Q&As now. So some questions on the Q&A board. So the first one is from Jennifer Fleischner. Martha, can you talk a bit about the ideas of what we do with money regarding a relationship? At times there's ambiguity, a loan, a gift, paying off, paying back, with Blair too, who seems to be paying the world back for her disturbances.
Yeah, great questions. Hi, Jennifer. I wanted those questions to be hanging out there without answers. Ellen at various points becomes anxious about, and rightly, I think, about offering Roy, her romantic interest, money. You know, that sets in motion all of her fears of, you know, what the hell is this guy going to do when I tell him I've just met him? By the way, $100 million. I mean, you know, how to really mess up the chances of a relationship, you know, getting off on the right foot when you drop that kind of a bomb on it, you know. So, you know, all the questions of trust and what can be risked, all the questions of generosity and what does it consist of, are there packed into just the small problem of, do I offer him some money for his kids' therapy and tell him that I just happened to find it sort of on the street? I mean, that's sort of how she describes it. I didn't want to elaborate that stuff too much. And I think what Jennifer said about Blair is very true, that questions of paying off, paying back, not owing, there's a very stark kind of, the money in Blair's world operates, you know, symbolically as just a series of walls and doors that have to be open and closed very quickly and clearly for specific reasons and purposes. And
also the source of family tensions, and coming from extremely, all of the figures coming from extremely difficult family circumstances, and the debt that creates. You know, that is suggested. So Dan Slack is writing, Martha, I'm really looking forward to reading the novel. We talked about this a little bit, Dan, but maybe she can say some more. Can you comment on how you maintained interest in the story for 15 years? Was it frustrating or fun to play with for that amount of time, or both?
Oh gosh, hi Danny. Danny's from my childhood. He probably might have called my childhood number at some point. Who knows? Yeah. There were times when I was throwing the book proverbially across the room, you know, in utter frustration. I never felt that I was going to walk out of or away from the story, but just a lot of, and Sheridan and I've been, I think, sharing about this all during this time, a lot of questions about how to bring it home, how to, you know, how to bring it to fruition and wrap it up. The actual ending, which I do not want to talk about, what really a couple of years went into false starts with that. So I also had other projects I was doing during this time. I wrote a memoir and I co-translated with Antonio, my husband, Antonio Tabucchi's stories. So it wasn't only this book. And sometimes I think it helped that I had to set it aside. The rigors of a full-time job also complicated the rhythms of my making of it. And since rhythm is a pretty important thing in this book,
Yes.
when it was interrupted, I wasn't making progress. So I just kind of galumphed along somehow, and managed. I knew when I had it. I knew when I'd roped it in. I knew then that it was done.
And here's a question from Fiona Maisel. Hi, Fiona. Martha, what was it like writing against the grain? Well, that's a good question. Knowing 99% of people who win the lottery would have no reservations about grabbing the money. Okay, maybe 85% or 75%, 70%. I heard you mention the difficulty of how to end the thing, but what about your premise? Did you feel like you'd have to win people over to her ambivalence?
Another great question. Hi, Fiona. And yeah, that just about sidelined me. The anxiety about that sidelined me initially. That was perhaps the scariest thing. Who's going to buy that it would take her that long? But the more I started thinking about it, the more I thought it's a month. Okay. It's not a year. And, as long as I had initially thought that she might reject it altogether. And that just seemed really preposterous. That I think that kind of ambivalence shading into, I won't even take it, would never have worked. But I felt that if I could keep people on board with, it's just a matter of answering some questions. And then if things started happening to her, just things start happening, the reader would accept, okay, it's a little intense, but she, especially with Roy, to kind of let that relationship develop a bit before lobbing the bomb into the relationship about the money, that seemed credible. So then I went with it.
You know what I would say too, what you do so well. I mean, Henry James says that, a plot is character, right? So the ambivalence before the windfall, the ambivalence is already in Ellen. So you began with a character whose difficulty is apparent to herself as well, and so the action comes after the character, right? So,
yeah, it was really important to me. In fact, I actually changed the plot so that the reader doesn't find out until around page 100 that the win has happened, because for precisely this reason, that it felt important to establish that this isn't a person who's got her act together, finds out she wins, and then is ambivalent, which wouldn't make a lot of sense. This is someone who's very self-conscious about her own difficulty in mobilizing in certain ways. And I needed to keep her interesting enough that the reader wouldn't just balk completely, but also have it seem kind of natural that she wouldn't just turn right around and walk into the first bank or the first attorney's office. And by the way, for any of you thinking about this for more than about 10 seconds, it actually is a real mess winning that much money.
I'm sure.
A mess. And I know all about it. I wish I knew all about it in person, but I know all about it. And
theoretically, you know all about it.
It's not as simple as it seems.
Here's another question from Amber Magruder. Hi, Martha. Can't wait to read the novel. With such an intricate plot and layered characters, how much time did you spend on plot development and pre-writing versus writing and allowing the story to reveal itself to you? I think we sort of touched on that a little bit. I don't know if you want to say any more.
Well, hi, Amber. And yeah, if by pre-writing you mean just sort of free writing all kinds of stuff, a fair bit of that had to happen, always does happen, I think. The plot, once I got the two characters weaving together, things became a little simpler because I could then think independently about each one and what sort of pressure points each one had to reach. But I'm never much of a mapping out of plot. It's
Right.
intuitive for me. I
Right.
grope my way into it.
And you know what's interesting to me is how the novel unfolds with, as I said, in this sort of chamber of echoes and resonances. I don't think that those things just arrive. I think that you accumulate them over time, because as you return to the
Yeah.
work that other things have happened, and and you bring that back in. Fiona left a PS, which I should say, which is just that this is a great novel. Thank you, Fiona, and I concur. Joan Goldberg says, did you find it hard to sell a book about a 50-something poet who it seems ruminates a lot? By the way, we knew each other in DC about 30-ish years ago. Can't wait to read the novel. Well, that's nice.
You see coincidence.
It's
so nice that you're here. That's really great. And the short answer to the question is sure. But that's I mean, is it hard to sell a novel about? But these days, is it hard to sell a novel? Period. The answer is sure.
Yeah.
Hate to be glum about it, but but I found a wonderful home with Red Hen. I could not. This is time for a shout out for my publisher. Shout out to Kate Gale and Monica and the whole team, Natasha, everyone who's been so great to me. So I got super lucky. In that sense, it was well worth the wait. So
Karen, I realizing we're against time here, so I'm just going to, Karen Outen says, Martha, I love the voice of the novel and the rhythm of your prose. How did the voice come to you? I had a note about that actually, because there's a lot of contractions and it's very colloquial. And so, this is obviously a decision to you. Karen asks, did you know immediately, or did you have to search for the right point of view?
Hi, Karen. And no, I knew that pretty soon. As soon as I started in on Ellen, her interiority felt real, and her rhythms, her tone, her cadences felt instinctive to me. So I don't know how or why, but they just did. I'm sure there's a fair bit of me in there, but she's not me. So I don't know. I got lucky. You get lucky sometimes. They set up shop in your head and there you go, Yeah,
that's right. And Jennifer says, and menopausal sex, yay. because
yay,
yay, let's hear it for menopausal sex. Yes, I should have mentioned that. Well, I did mention the romance, which is very, I found, really, really touching and completely credible. And and as you say, it's amazing how when you get an intimacy like that right, it's waves of plausibility help you all the way through the narrative. And this is true of the character of Ennio, the child, also too. So we have to stop now. Can you believe that we went through an hour? And you'll read the chat, and here's Melanie. So I'm going to stop speaking, except to say thank you so much, Martha, and thanks for answering my questions. And I love the book.
Thank you, Sheridan. Thank you so much, Sheridan. Thank you.
Martha, before we sign off, would you like to share what your next adventure is?
Oh, in 30 seconds, I'm surrounded by moving boxes because Antonio and I are moving to Italy. So I appreciate so much having this chance to do this on New York shores with the Center for Fiction. Thank you again, Melanie. Thanks to the whole center. And Sheridan, you're just the best. And everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you for helping me bring this book into the world.
Yes, and
Great.
please buy the book. We'll drop the
Yeah.
link in the chat one more time. Thank you, Martha. Happy travels. And thank you, Sheridan. And
Thanks,
if you
Melanie.
haven't taken a reading group with Sheridan yet, I highly recommend
Yes.
it. So, all right, and we'll see you all again soon.
Okay, take care. Happy summer.
Take care.